Welcome everybody to JFK Live with Larry Hancock and David Boylan. David, welcome. I don't know if people haven't read about Larry Hancock and David Boylan, but they are the authors of a new book about Lee Harvey Oswald, The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald. And it's a very interesting book because it does not track with these all too familiar grooves of the JFK literature, the conspiracy meme, the lone nut meme, and really dig into the record and talk about Oswald, independent of all those other stories, but who was this person moving through life and how did they think about it? And they bring a tremendous amount of knowledge to it. Larry's a veteran JFK researcher, author of Somebody Would Have Talked, a penetrating book about that very subject. Somebody would have talked about a conspiracy to kill the president. Shadow Warriors, a book about covert warfare, the history of covert warfare as military doctrine and practice. I just put, in case everybody doesn't know, how to purchase their mandatory purchase of the Oswald Puzzle, and the link is in the chat. So go and buy it now, and then you can listen in. Larry describes himself, he lives in rural Oklahoma, and he describes himself as a blue dot in a red ocean. So he's out there doing this incredible research. David Boylan is my go-to guy on JM Wave, South Florida, CIA assets. I call him up and I say, who was the brother of that guy? And he's got the answer right away. So between the two of them, they brought a tremendous amount of knowledge to bear on the question of who was Lee Harvey Oswald. So, I want to start with you guys with some of the basic questions that I get all the time about Oswald. And tell us how you answer them. So a couple of things. One, is Oswald intelligent? Is he a psychopath? Is he a lunatic? What is he? Just kind of as a basic personality type. And then also, is he truly a leftist or is he a faker? How politically radical was he? Was he a true Marxist-Leninist or not? So let's just start with those. When people ask you those questions, what do you say?
Well, and you're right. Those are probably the most common questions. And I think one of the things, just to set the stage, that David and I looked for in treating him was to look for continuity. Continuity, consistency in his belief and his remarks. Because if you just slice him at one point in time, as we often do in the conspiracy world, and you look at him in respect to one thing, you might come up with a different answer. So consistently, Oswald was bright. There's no doubt that he was bright. In school, he tested IQ test of 118, which is very bright by the time he got to high school. If you look at his writings, you find that he is extremely well read. He can express himself well. He has some problems with his spelling every now and then, no doubt. But in the Marine Corps, it's striking that one of the officers he worked under, actually, who was a Georgetown graduate of, world affairs, would rated Oswald very highly and talked to, he could talk to him on his level, and he rated Oswald as the kind of guy who wouldn't hesitate to do that. He's got two stripes and he's talking to an officer and he doesn't mind going toe to toe. So he was like that too. And then even when he's in employment interviews, one of the problems that Oswald always had is he would test well in employment interviews in Texas after he came back to the U.S. He would test well, he would interview well, dressed well, presented himself well. And, we find over and over again that the employment people would like to place him in better jobs than he got. But Oswald was always needed a job this week. He has no money, he's out of work. Marina, he's got a baby, so they always have to put him in manual jobs. And unfortunately, quite frankly, before he got his job in photography, the only employment he'd had been in metalworking in Russia, which is not a good thing to put on a resume for employment in Texas in 1963. But Oswald is intelligent. He expresses himself well. There's no doubt about that. As far as his politics, that's very consistent. I think people don't look far enough back in Fort Worth before he goes into the Marines. And he's writing to the Young Socialist Federation, expressing his beliefs and his allegiance to a socialist view of the world, economic justice, racial justice. And he writes to them and says, he asserts himself. He says, this is what I believe in. So right off, at a young age, he's asserting that. And he's also saying, I'd like to join. And is there a local group I can join? Which immediately kind of puts to bed this is an asocial guy because he wants to join a group. And by the way, if I don't find a group to join, I'll start one. Could I start one here? So that's kind of, David, do you want to chime in? That's not the Oswald you see in the Warren Commission.
Right. Yeah.
No, he was actually very well read at a young age. He was, I'm sure we all know the books he got from the New Orleans Library there in '63, but he was always interested in learning more, especially, like you said, the socialist agenda, essentially way back in the day. So always interested in it.
Yeah. One thing I was interested in, somebody sent me Oswald's possessions after he was arrested, and the novel 1984 appears in there. And he had written to his mother in 1961 asking her to send him a copy of 1984, which, if you think about it, he's living in the Soviet Union. Orwell, of course, is banned in the Soviet Union as an anti-communist heretic. And Oswald's trying to import his books into the Soviet Union. So, but very well read, right?
And Tidovitz was jealous of that. Tidovitz writes about the fact that even in Russia, Oswald can get books that Tidovitz can't get in books because they get shipped to him. But another thing on the pack rat, and David did a great job on this, Oswald was a pack rat. It impressed us when we started going through the records from Dallas, the photographs that the police had taken from his apartment, his possessions, that like Oswald saved everything. So you've got a collection of what literature he was reading, what he subscribed to, what books he had checked out of the library, books he checked out of the library, and by the way, failed to return. So, there's that. But we've got a very long history of that sort of thing. There's if he hadn't been such a pack rat, David and I were impressed. It's like you start going through the police photos of his possessions, and at first you see, there's one page and there's one thing, and then there's another thing. And then like you see a whole table full of stuff, and they're just like gave up, forget it. We got to take pictures, but he's got too much stuff, including receipts, like receipts from almost everything he ever bought or paid for. It's amazing.
Uh-huh. So on the question of, was he a genuine leftist, or was he just pretending to be that? What would you say to people who ask that question?
Well, everything if he was not a leftist, literally everything he did from his teen years on tells us that story. One of his friends in New Orleans, when he joined the astronomy club, he had a couple of friends in the astronomy club, and he went home with one of them. Okay, and they're talking astronomy, but Oswald he's a talker when he's around people that he can talk to. So he starts talking about his political beliefs and about socialism and Marxism. And the dad hears this. And again, your son is not talking about this in New Orleans in, 58, I guess. And so the father joins in, and Oswald gets kicked out of the house. Like, you're not going to contaminate my kid, So if you're looking for consistency, he is always reading and talking and writing about being a socialist Marxist. He doesn't make a lot of discrimination, probably more, Marxism is the core of it as far as economics. Is always very concerned about the working class. David, do you want to?
You nailed it 100%. He's very consistent from way back, looking at the Young Socialist Party, the socialism, as far as his reading material, what he was interested in. when he's talking about to his, Marine buddies too, Nelson Delgado, who's always interested in Cuba. They said, let's go see, Cuban Revolution. That's very consistent. He's been talking about that since what? He was what,
Yeah.
16 years old, pretty much 15.
You guys mentioned an incident which especially interested me. The anti-racist Oswald. And the story had always stuck in my mind when Oswald was in the courtroom in New Orleans after fighting with the Cubans. He went into the courtroom. It was legally segregated at the time. And he goes and he sits in the colored section. And Carlos Bringuer testified. He saw that and he thought, oh, what a clever communist propagandist he is, by going and sitting with the colored people. And so, this was used against Oswald as proof that he hated America, that he believed in civil rights. That was, and he was dissatisfied with America. But you guys tell the story when he was in junior high, he got beat up for sitting in the back of the bus with the black kids.
In Russia, the first remarks he made that were anti-American remarks, and that's true. He's talking about things he didn't like about America. Race is a big part of it. Race is always a part of it. Oswald sees himself, not himself, but particularly it's the people that are left out. He is those are the people he kind of inherently sides with, the folks that have been left out, that whether you want to call that Marxism or whatever, but race was a big part of it. And he writes about that. He's still writing about that in 1963 in terms of opposing racist and fascist and, being especially for integration at that point in time. So that's a constant for him.
Yeah. And George de Mohrenschildt also said that how unusual that was for a white man from the South who hadn't gone to college, right? A working class white man had this instinctive sympathy for the common man, for civil rights. And I thought the way you guys brought that out was really, really good. We will take questions as the conversation goes on. If you want to ask Larry and David a question, why don't you put it in the chat and we'll take some of those later on. So other themes that come up a lot in Oswald conversations. This is one that we dealt with a lot when we had Rami Schmatt on talking about Oswald passing through Helsinki and Finland and kind of the puzzle of how he gets into the Soviet Union. How did you come down and what did you feel about the question of Oswald as the false defector or the controlled defector or the something? How did you guys, what did you think about that question?
Well, the first thing, and again, if we're talking about consistent behaviors, the one thing that you find about Oswald throughout, whether he's in school or whether he's in the Marines or whether he's at work, or he does not take orders well. There's no sign that Oswald is the kind of person who will willingly go along with what you want him to go along with. Yeah, like in Russia, Oswald may be certainly the only American, but one of the few Russians who actually went on strike in a Russian factory, which doesn't speak well to his being some kind of an asset either. It's kind of like, should you be annoying these people? Should you be bringing attention to yourself? His boss tells him, his boss is a friend. He's going out with the boss's daughters and they're going on picnics or whatever. And Oswald decides to do his own private work stoppage, which is not good. But, there are a lot of things he does inside Russia to draw attention to himself that you really would not expect. So, someone who's maintaining a low profile and picking up information to do. But, it's not. So bottom line, we see Oswald acting on his own agendas all the time. Does that mean that he might not be forced to compromise at some point? I think the closest we see is when he's trying to come back to the U.S. And the State Department opposes his return to the U.S. fiercely because they regard him as an asshole. I mean, that's the only word that you can use for it. When he came into Russia, he was uncooperative. He had an attitude problem. He would, they don't like him. In fact, the funniest thing about it is that normally for a real defector or a real pro-Soviet Marxist guy, the Russians would immediately take the American to task, to Pravda. They'd make a big propaganda deal out of him themselves. They don't do that with Oswald. It's the U.S., it's the State Department that introduces him to media people that repeat his remarks against the U.S. It's like, wait a minute, whoa, what is this? The State Department didn't like him. When he decides he's going to return, they really do give him a hard time for the better part of a year. And they, we won't correspond with you. You've got to come to Moscow. Well, it's not legal for me to come to Moscow. I don't have it. You got to come to Moscow. Okay. It's so, but on his way home, and there are two things that come in here. There is a line of evidence that says that somewhere at some point in time, whether it's the State Department or the CIA, collects some information about Oswald's time in Russia, whether he provides it himself or whatever, because that information actually comes through the State Department and is routed to Soviet division. And that's kind of interesting, so I think we speculate, did at some point in time he give in and say, all right, you guys, I'll tell you something about my time in Russia if you'll just knock it off and let it, my wife and baby and I come back. Because on the way back on the boat, he did write that to himself, because he was expecting to be met by the press, which he wasn't, which is kind of strange. And he writes the fact that he would never let himself be used again. So something happened that did really annoy him. Did he provide some information? We can see that happening. I don't think we see any signs. One of the things we did was we went and looked at what you would expect to see for someone who had really been prepared to collect information. The U.S. had a lot of programs as to who they recruited, how they prepped them, how they debriefed them. And the Warren Commission actually even looked into that. And Oswald doesn't match any of those profiles. But so long-winded answer, Jeff. David, you have something better to say.
Well,
there's always been that whole question. Sorry, go ahead,
yeah.
Jeff.
No, go ahead, David.
It's always been that whole question: was Oswald witting or unwitting? There's people that much smarter than me about what's going on over there with some of the CIA files, but witting, the reading I've done, they usually that's usually listed in the PRQ2 file in your 201 file. And that's where they actually say, is this person witting or unwitting? PRQ is the personal record questionnaire. Like, who is this person? When were they born? Where are they from? Everything they need to know about them. And then they actually say, is this person witting or unwitting? They actually list that in the PRQ form, which is supposed to be part of the 201 file.
Right.
Also part of the 201 file is supposed to have whether the person is a POA, provisional operational approval. Is this person part of a project? Does he have approval to be part of this? And then that actually goes into operational approval, yes. And the green list, part of the 201 file, yes. Oswald doesn't have any of those things. Are they in somebody's desk? Were they in somebody's desk? Maybe. Maybe they was not actually put into the 201 file that SIG had. They had separate, pieces spread out? Maybe, so there's always that battle I have. Was he unwitting or witting,
So you have various, just to dive a little bit deeper on this question, you have these various CIA programs, Red Sox, Redskin. Is Oswald involved in any of those, do you think?
Not only does he not show up, as David said, not only is there no record, and of course a record could have been destroyed. We're not naive, been doing this for 3 decades. Okay, we understand records destruction, but that's what it really got is we went back and looked at the profiles for each of those programs, who they picked. In one program, they're picking largely college students who are from Georgetown or from an Eastern university, and they're putting them inside Russia to monitor basically Russian social systems and politics, and because they have that kind of background, they know what to look for and they're going to report on that.
Right.
Another program is to take scientists who are working in certain disciplines, scientists and engineers, because we even know what the CIA wasn't interested in everything. At that point in time, they have some targets, and they're interested in rockets, and particularly anti-aircraft, anti-missile rockets. And
Right.
so they pick scientists, and they're going to send them to conventions where they can collect information. And then there are good descriptions of how they pick these people and how they train them. They didn't just send them in. They pull them out of what they're doing and train them. And when they come back, they even train domestic case officers to debrief them at length. And they take them somewhere off secure for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time and do it. So I guess the answer to that is, Jeff, Oswald he doesn't have any of those backgrounds so that he would be a good fit as a recruit. He doesn't have any kind of training, and so there's just no match. It's true he might have picked up some things about being inside Russia and had opinions. Oswald would certainly have opinions. When Oswald got back from Russia, he expressed his opinion in writing. One of the first things he did is express the opinion was that basically Russia sucks. I mean, again, just to cut to the chase, he writes in his draft manuscript that it's bureaucratic. It didn't. Russia, the Soviets are not implementing the socialist Marxist system, whatever they say they're doing. And actually, he even writes in a very, very literate, very perceptive manner that Soviet Union is using the World Communist Party as a tool of their own nationalism. Now, I got to ask you, how many American politicians would have even picked up on that in 1963, 1962? It's a very sanguine opinion of what's going on. So, in any event, what we find is that he went on his own because he wanted to find out how they were handling it, hoping to find what he wanted to see. And he didn't find it and came back.
Right. And do you find anything, there's a question, well, why wasn't he debriefed when he came back, or was he debriefed? Was that unusual, or how does that factor into your portrait or understanding of Oswald?
If he had been a designated asset, he would have been debriefed. I mean, even the Warren Commission went through the people that were false defectors and looked at how they were handled one by one, because there's a list of them, and looked at how they'd been handled. No sign that Oswald was debriefed in that fashion, although, like I say, he may well have been questioned. Normally, and what it looks like to me, normally, if he didn't do the formal thing, and if they just want to informally debrief him without he really knowing what's going on, they would have used a media asset to do that. Because Oswald's back and Oswald talks, right? You set him down with the media, he will talk. They didn't do that even. So whatever they collected, which Oswald was upset about, was fairly minimal, which again looks like maybe a State Department processing. We're going to let you back in, but there are questions you have to answer before. That seems more reasonable. Not a CIA formal debrief having been on an assignment.
Right. What about the question of upon his return, does he have a relationship with the FBI? This is a rumor that the Warren Commission picks up on. Obviously, FBI agent James Hosty has some contact with his wife, with Marina. What did you make of that? Is that
he has a relationship, and this is David. David should take this one because he really dug into this. Does he have a relationship with the FBI? Yes, a very bad relationship with the FBI. In fact, so bad that in New Orleans, he lies to them repeatedly to the point that if they had realized what he was doing to them, they should have picked him up and charged him. David, why don't you go into Oswald volunteering to the FBI and what he volunteered?
Yeah.
Well, he spilled the beans that there was this huge organization in New Orleans, FPCC, And, was it Alec Idell was, one of the main members. And he said, oh, we have phone calls. We all call each other when the next meeting's going to be. And he was the only person for the FPC that in New Orleans. He was lying to the FBI, which is a crime. So when they started looking at A.J. Idell, search for him, they couldn't find him because that's Oswald, is an alias that he used for his documentation and ordering things. So it's a crime. If he was an FBI asset, he'd, go ahead.
He really did a good job on it. He talks about the fact that the people's names are not recorded. This is like clandestine, and they don't meet in public, and they meet in people's houses, and they rotate locations, and you only know there's going to be a meeting because you get a telephone call. The FBI's got to love this. This shows up in TV programs. This is your perfect cell operating within the U.S. And this Heidel guy is, obviously an agent of some sort. Plus, of course, the FPCC is on their list already as a target. They're supposed to be. So Oswald is just, yeah.
But so why is Oswald the man in his own day-to-day reality? Why is he doing that, do you think?
I would love to be able to totally answer. But one of the things we do know is this is after he's been arrested. I mean, he's just in jail and when he asked to talk to them. And so Oswald at this point in time, as we write, he does have a pro-Cuba agenda. His interest is in kind of, presenting himself as a Cuban agitator, street leafleter. He'll say that later in Mexico City. I'm with the revolution. I proved it in New Orleans. So he knows the FBI is going to be looking at him, right? He's been out there on the street. He's been on TV protesting for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which he knows is a target of the FBI. So he's they're going to come looking for him, right? He's been on TV. The FBI is going to come looking for him. So what it feels like is he preempts them. Oswald is a bright guy. It's like, I'm not going to let them come look for me and my wife and my baby. I'm going to go talk to them and send them after this Heidel character. And son of a gun, they go after the Heidel character. And by the time they don't even visit Oswald again. They never interview Oswald. They're out looking for Heidel. And by the time they figure out there is no Heidel, he's gone out of New Orleans. So, it kind of looks like he used it as a diversion.
So related to that, Oswald, obviously he's of interest to the FBI. He gets arrested. He wants to talk to the FBI. Then a few days later, he's in court. And all these Cubans connected with the CIA show up. Carlos, you mentioned a bunch of them. Carlos Bringuier, the local delegate for the Cuban Student Directorate, Frank Barthez, a dispossessed railroad magnate, Ernesto Rodriguez, brother of Emilio Rodriguez, and Emilio Rodriguez might have been there that day too. So all of which raises the question, which I'm interested in, which is Oswald on the CIA's radar in New Orleans?
Yes.
I'll hand this over to David, because David is the one that really found this, what I consider to be an explosive connection between Ernesto Rodriguez and Emilio Rodriguez, who is a key guy at JM Wave anti-Cuban operations. I'll let you talk about it. So is he on the radar? And my quick answer is there's no way he could not be on the radar. David, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, you got Emilio Rodriguez, the whole backstory to him. He was his father, Ernesto Rodriguez Sr., was also an asset for the CIA briefly. They ran an electronics business in Havana, and Emilio worked for his father. And he ended up being recruited by Henry Heckscher, as using the alias of Nelson Raynock. So this is back in 1960. So you got Emilio Rodriguez being recruited by the CIA. And he became such a great asset that he ended up working with Tony Sforza and David Morales. So you got Morales and Sforza working closely with Emilio Rodriguez in Havana. They set up the Stay Behind network. A lot of these guys were the early AMOTs, guys with the radios saying what's going on in Havana just prior to and just after the Bay of Pigs. So they stayed, no, you got Sforza and Emilio Rodriguez hanging around Havana until June of 61, where they managed to get exfiltrated by boat. So they ended up in Miami, and you have David Morales saying, yeah, these guys are great. Sforza's been working for the CIA for years. Emilio's a new contract agent. So we got to find space for them in Miami. So he said, let's get an office for Tony, but we want to keep Emilio Rodriguez on the outside. We don't want him going through JM Wave, at the time. We don't want people knowing who he is. So Emilio Rodriguez ended up being a recruiter. He'd try and get other Cubans to defect. That was his major job. Carlos Lechuga, a couple of the others, he was very successful doing that. So when his brother Ernesto actually talked to Oswald, when Oswald first came to New Orleans, he wanted to learn how to speak Spanish because he wanted to go to Cuba. That was one of his basic things. So he contacted Ernesto Rodriguez at the Berlitz School of Modern Language. And, he walked in there, and this is Ernesto Rodriguez saying this. So he's saying that, no, Oswald came in, he said, very smart. He says, I want to learn Spanish. He said he was a little bit, cute. Then he said he started speaking in Russian. And then Ernesto says, I know a little bit of Russian, but I couldn't keep up with him. He said, no, Oswald could speak it very fluently. And he said, after that, I just gave up. So that's how close, that's what Ernesto Rodriguez do. But Oswald also came up and he says, I want to know, who are the Cubans around here? I want to talk to them. Who do I contact? So Ernesto Rodriguez gave him Carlos Bermudez's address. Sure.
Hold on. So Oswald is looking for Cubans.
Yes.
That's the conversation that he has with Ernesto. So he's
about Spanish,
engage with anti-Castro Cubans, right? Or
yes.
While at the same time maintaining this Alec Heidel
this was before
identity, a left-wing identity. But
this is before he actually came more public with passing out the leaflets and things. So this is where he got Carlos Bermudez's name and address, was from Ernesto Rodriguez. These guys were good friends. And they would actually travel to John Birch Society meetings together in 62. Both were members of the Cuban Revolutionary Council back then, before Bruguière left and became a member of the DRE. So these two were close. So this is where Oswald got all the various Cubans places to go see. And it was after this is when he went to go see Carlos Bermudez in his store. Brought him the manual. Hey, I want to fight for the anti-Castro side, fight against Castro. So this is the initial connection that we can find. It was through Ernesto, whose brother is Emilio, who's a big JM Wave guy.
No, I think I got it. So one thing that you guys didn't mention in your book, which I always thought was significant, was a letter that Oswald writes to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee right before all of this happens. And he says, I got in a fight with the Gusanos and I got a lot of publicity. So he writes this letter on August 1st to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The fight is 10 days in the future. So it seems like he was planning this whole business of getting into a fight and getting newspaper coverage. And it's like, that letter to me indicates it was very premeditated because he's talking about it before it happened. So it was like, and he's like almost predicting what he's going to do. So what do you think was going on there?
I see it exactly that way, Jeff, in all honesty. And this is fairly new to me. I will say a lot of things I see about Oswald now, I see in the context of kind of getting inside this character. And we know at this point in time, Oswald is fixated on Cuba. He's become fixated on Cuba, and he wants to go to Cuba. And I suspect he wants to go to Cuba, and he's going to need some credentials to get there, because it was easy for him to travel to Russia. It was legal for him to do that. He did that legally. It's no longer legal to travel to Cuba from the US. So he can't just go there. Even when he gets his new passport, it's stamped that it's not good for travel to Cuba. So he's going to have to come up with, and by the way, the Cubans are pretty suspicious of Americans. The CIA has been working pretty hard at infiltrating people into Cuba. And so, it's not going to be easy. So I suspect that he had in his own mind, he's going to present himself to these Cubans. He's going to become a known factor. Bringier's place is just like blocks away from where he's going to be doing this leafleting. He's called the TV station. We find the local TV and radio stations in his book. He's looking at media contacts. And when Bringier shows up, the first thing he does is say, "Carlos, go ahead and hit me." Like he's waiting for this. He wants a street altercation. He wants to create this resume as a hardcore Cuban revolutionary supporter. So yeah, I do. That made no sense to me before, kind of now. But yeah, I think it was he knows what he is setting up. And interestingly enough, what he didn't suspect, I think, is the fact that they were going to trust him and start sending people to see if he was who he thought he was. So they send Quiraga to test him, and Quiraga goes to him as a pro-Castro supporter, right? And Oswald is kind of like taught. So these guys already know that there's something wrong with, they're suspicious of Oswald. This is all being reported back through the DRE to Miami. This guy showed up. He says he's with us. We're not sure that he is, and and Miami says test him. Send somebody to test him, and they're reporting back, we tested him and we don't trust him. Oswald has just put himself in like major at risk because he had an interesting little game that he thought he was playing, but then these other people are going to come up with their own little game.
Mm-hmm. So, does Oswald, in your view, sense what is he thinking in the fall of 1963? Does he have an animus against President Kennedy?
No, and again, we kind of lead off with that. We all know when the Warren Commission would have loved to find a motive, right? They wanted to find just one person that would say that he had, he disliked him. He does not. Even in his writing, he talks about the fact that Kennedy might be the guy to reach a detente type situation with Khrushchev. Maybe he's the guy to do it. When he's interviewed on radio, if you listen to that tape, the radio host tries to push him into talking against JFK. Oswald backs off and just says, "No, my issue is with the American policies towards Cuba. It's a policy thing. It's not a personal thing." And why would he? I mean, everything Oswald says he believes in, racial integration, racial justice, it's Kennedy.
Yeah.
There's no reason there would be any animus.
So now let's move on to November 22nd. And I mean, we're going to telescope a lot of things here, but just, the day of Oswald's movements and actions on the day of the 22nd. Maybe start with Buell Frazier's story. Did Oswald bring a gun to the school book depository and say it was curtain rods? Do you think? Where do you think about it?
We do not think so. And that's one thing for those that are listening or whatever. David and I'd like to be very clear about the book. The first 2/3 of the book is history. It's biography of Lee Harvey Oswald. The last third of the book is our speculation, because we all know that Oswald did behave strangely on that Thursday and Friday. So if he wasn't behaving strangely because he was shooting the president, and in no way do we think he was, we offer a scenario for what we think went down that day. And no, he did not bring a rifle. He wasn't aware that a rifle had been found. It's kind of fascinating, even though they show him this picture of him with a rifle once he's in jail, they don't show him the rifle from the school book depository. They don't say, Lee, did you take this to work today? We found that it's used to shoot, and by the way, this bag, you brought it in this bag, right? They don't do that, you know. So no, we don't think he took a rifle. If he took anything, maybe he took curtain rods, maybe he took his lunch. I'm kind of in the he took his lunch category myself, but he was not expecting. He had his own agenda for what he was thought was going to happen that way, and it had nothing to do with JFK, other than JFK might divert some attention while he helped hijack a plane and fly to Cuba. Totally, totally different. That was his agenda. And that's what we go through in the final, why we would believe that, what the evidence is for that he had his own agenda that he was pursuing and got set up and framed by these people that first had connected to him in New Orleans, representing themselves as pro-Castro.
Mm-hmm. So you see his actions in New Orleans as actions to implicate him in a future assassination.
Yeah,
is that
whether it's, and I'll let David weigh, but whether or not it started out that way, because we know, for more than we know, that the DRE had a propaganda assignment. And you've written about the fact that they began a propaganda assignment with Oswald, in August, so we don't know if it started out rather, okay, we're just going to use this guy as an image that we're going to use in propaganda. And then they start cultivating that. And along the way, it changes, or when and where exactly it changes. We're trying to work through that, but we don't know that now. But yeah, they began manipulating him in New Orleans, contacted him, and continued that for a month or more, manipulating him to position him in the right way. Was that already part of the conspiracy? I suspect it was by the time he got to McCowan's and Odio's. Whether it was earlier, I don't know.
Jeff, you mentioned Frank Barthez. He was an FBI informant and also a CIA contact. So the FBI spoke to him. He was at Oswald's court appearance, and he had a argument with Oswald outside the court appearance. So he knew who Oswald was. So September 10th, FBI comes to see him and said, we're looking for Oswald. Have you seen him? He goes, I don't know who Oswald is. Did I even know him right there? So I'm guessing Oswald was in play around September 10th. Something was being done with him then that Barthez is denying even knowing who he is.
Yeah, I always wondered about that Barthez, and Barthez in the JFK files that have come out since 2017. His CIA connection, his code name AmSurf1 has become public. So he was definitely a codenamed CIA asset. No question about it. So why would he turn around and say he didn't know Oswald after being in the same courtroom with him? And the people said that favoring Oswald because he was pro-Castro, and like Barthez was there, he wasn't just a passive bystander. He was actually, a participant in a confrontation. And then 3 weeks later, he says he doesn't know the guy. A question from the chat. Jim asks, do you believe Oswald was one of the shooters in Dealey Plaza, or was he part of an operation to stop the assassination from taking place?
Neither. Definitely not a shooter. Definitely. We don't see that he had any knowledge of the attack on the president at all. What we see is that he was, and the scenario you lay out is he had a choice at that point in time. He had a choice. He had been given an offer by these Cubans who were manipulating him to set him up as a patsy. And he either had a choice to play with that or tell them to take a hike. And he had to make a decision on that when he went to visit Marina Thursday night. And based on her response and not moving with him immediately as he wanted, he made the decision that he was going to Cuba. So we see his activities that day totally disconnected from the attack on the president, other than the fact that he was being framed for it. Not his fault.
If you read Sylvia Odio's complete, disposition, what she had said, that when Oswald, it was Oswald that was there, in the two Cubans who look like Mexicans, but were Cuban, Leopoldo, who we suspect was Victor Espinosa, probably 90% sure about that. He was close to Frank Barthez. Um, that whole thing. We go over that a little bit in the book, but we can really break that down quite a bit. Leopoldo said, Oswald, what's the reason we went to go see you was we wanted to get Oswald into Cuba. You through the underground, can you get him there? And she refuses, says, no, I can't do that. I mean, that's right there. Say, no, I can't get him into Cuba. I don't want to do that. And that was one of the reasons they went to go see her. And then, they turned around and said, you could either shoot Castro or you could shoot Kennedy, that whole scene afterwards on the phone when Oswald wasn't there. So
and this meeting takes place, is this meeting when Oswald shows up at Sylvia Odio's door with these two men, and you believe that was Oswald? Is he
yes.
on his way to Mexico City when?
Yes.
And so he's on his way to try and get into Cuba when people are.
Yeah. And we think that's part of manipulating him, Jeff, that they were setting up their own. I mean, they had to establish themselves in his mind as people who could help him do what he wanted to do. As David and I both said, the easiest way to con somebody is to get them, tell them you're going to help them do what they want to do. It's not about what you want to do. It's about what they want to do. And this is like the McCowan visit earlier before Odio. They're taking him to McCowan's and letting him listen to a conversation where they want to buy rifles for a revolution in Central America. Now, the U.S. is not buying rifles for a revolution in Central America. It pretty much would be Cuba. Okay.
Right.
Then they go on to one of the things we don't know, we know about that conversation because it was in English. We don't know what in the world they told him about the visit to Odio. Kind of like they're speaking Spanish, right? He's not a real good speak. It's like, oh, by the way, we visited this lady. She has connections in Dallas. This is great. We're going to make this work for you. Just like the week of the assassination, he doesn't get to hear the conversation with the guy that they're talking about leasing the airplane from. I mean, this is great. You let him hear what you want him to hear. You control the message. And Oswald wants to do this. That's unfortunately makes him susceptible.
Right. So just to go back for a second, you mentioned he goes to see McCowan. So just tell people who McCowan is and what happened here, because people may be less familiar with that than they are with the Odio visit.
McCowan is kind of, if you want to frame Oswald and tie him to Castro, McCowan is the guy to do it. McCowan ran guns to the Cuban Revolution against Batista. He ran whole shiploads of guns to the Cuban Revolution against Batista. The DRE, the guys inside Cuba, only had a couple of real well-established gun runners in the U.S. They were really strapped for getting weapons. McCowan was a key guy. And actually, we feel, if you go back in history, just to put a tie in, the FBI managed to bust him in his gun running. And one of the key people that maybe have been involved in busting him, who testified anonymously, would be Jack Ruby, who at the time was a provisional criminal informant for the FBI, probably on gun running. We know he was already interested in Cuba at that time. And later, is connected to McCowan. The ties are there between Ruby and McCowan in Cuba. But anyway, so McCowan is so well known and so liked in Cuba that when Castro comes to the UN, he says, hey, I got to stop by and visit my buddy McCowan down in Texas. And so he does. And so like McCowan is like this with Castro media wise. So if you could have connected Oswald to McCowan after the assassination and you're trying to sell a pitch that, okay, Cuba did this and Castroites did this, McCowan is ideal. McCowan was,
he's a pro-Castro American.
Yeah, exactly.
He was actually friends with
Castro even invited him to join his regime. Like, come down, be part of this.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, McCowan was also friends with Carlos Prio, they were good friends. And Priya would come visit him in Houston too, so, and
Carlos Prio was the previous president of Cuba before Batista. Just want to remind people of that. Um, so let's go to November 22nd. Uh, so you don't think Oswald's up there in the window with a gun? What is going on? He's Oswald's seen right after the assassination, sitting in the cafeteria. I always thought that was curious. Oswald's politically aware guy, liked Kennedy. Why isn't he out watching the motorcade? Like, so what was going on in Oswald's mind, do you think, on the morning of November 22nd?
I wish for sure. I wish I knew for sure, but I'll give you that's a very personal take. Oswald, and I use the term, Oswald was not a joiner. Oswald was not a fanboy. Oswald is not hanging with the crowd. Now, so Oswald is not going to be He talked to a couple of people that day, and actually, based on their remarks, it's kind of like, oh, there's something going on. The president's coming. Oswald knew that. He reads the paper. He watches TV. He absolutely knew that was happening. So I have no problem not seeing him hanging out on the steps with the other guys, because that's just not what. If it were a Russian factory, maybe so, but an American, no. So Oswald, not being a fanboy, is kind of setting himself aside, I think. But plus, he had his own agenda. I don't think his plan, as I would see it, and we didn't do that in this book because we didn't discuss this in that great a detail. I think his plan was probably to slip out the side right at the time of the motorcade. And what we were told, and we've always been told from John Martino, back to someone would have talked, was Oswald was supposed to leave the school book depository, go to the Texas Theater, and meet a contact who would get him out of Dallas. We think he was told that contact would actually go to the airport where they had tried to rent an airplane. He thought they'd rented an airplane. That was part of the plan. We don't think Oswald was, that, like I say, he was following that agenda, and where everything goes off track is when he starts to go off that agenda when he hears about the assassination of the president. It's back to the, going back to his apartment to pick up a pistol, being dropped off, away from his apartment rather than right out in front. Things get really anomalous at that point in time. He's not behaving in a straightforward fashion as you would expect, but that's because he may already expect, wait a minute, nobody said anything about the president being attacked. It's, we were supposed to slide out of here. Now everybody is going to be on the edge. That would be my cut. That's when that's when his plan changes. He was supposed to be killed in a fashion that would implicate Cuba and Castro. And David, I think this is a good time maybe to insert. These guys had a plan. It didn't work, to incriminate him because he got taken into custody. But I think it would be good to talk a little bit about the call to Mrs. Luce, because I think that's something we cover in the book that most people aren't aware of, which really reveals what their plan had been.
Supposedly, it was a member of the DRE, one of her, what you call it, one of her boys that she supposedly supported along with William Pauley as far as their maritime operations and their raids on Cuba. And she said the phone call she got from the person knew that Oswald had been in Mexico, and he was coming back with a Mexican hit squad to kill JFK. And this is what, Larry, the day after? Nobody knew that Oswald.
That night, nobody knows Oswald's been in Mexico City except the guys that knew he'd been in Mexico City.
But the person, So there's kind of a clue there, like who was running it. Would I miss, Larry? Anything on that one?
Well, and they claim to have evidence. They claim that they've been monitoring Oswald. They've had him under surveillance, that they have tapes of him, that they can provide evidence that he's been working in Mexico, working with a Cuban attack team. Now, this is really radical stuff because of what they're claiming. And you can imagine what would happen. This is Claire Booth Luce, whose husband controls the largest media network in the United States, Life magazine. If Claire had told that to her husband and he put that in print the next day, the Strategic Air Command is on its way to Cuba. There's just no doubt about that. But which ties in with a lot of other things. But
let me just remind people, this is a conversation that is recounted by Claire Booth Luce, a leading conservative columnist and political activist, one of the leading, political voices of her day, and the wife of Henry Luce, the editor-in-chief of Time Life magazine, the great publishing empire. So, yeah, a very important person. And she tells this story. She gets a call on the night of the assassination from somebody from the DRE who tells this story. We know who this guy is, I take that story very seriously because Jose Antonio Lanusa of the DRE told me of the time that he went to Claire Booth Luce's apartment in New York. And what they wanted was they wanted her to give the group a check, and they would have one of those pictures taken with a giant check, and that would show that she was behind them. And so they were talking about this with her. And Henry Luce comes in and he hears what they're talking about and he blows up and he forbids his wife from having anything to do with these people because it's like it's too controversial, it's too it's too committed, and so but this close relationship that the DRE had with Claire Booth Luce, I mean, Jose Antonio said we were in this beautiful Park Avenue apartment and we were talking about this is what we wanted, and Henry Luce came in and and so this was not something that was invented by Claire Booth Luce. It was something that even the guys in the DRE knew about and were very proud about. This was one of their good connections.
And this was just part of the, I think you asked about what happened that Friday. That Friday. So what happened was Oswald got taken into custody. That was never supposed to happen. And then what you see that night and the next day are a whole set of activities from this very specific group of people, DRE. I mean, you can list the names that they're trying. My view is that they're trying to, like, okay, wait a minute. How can we recover our story? How do we re-seize the message? We need to gain the narrative. What do we have that can gain the narrative? And the only good news is they just got squashed. Like, I'm sorry, there's no conspiracy. Too bad, you lose.
Yeah, no, and I found the story that the House Un-American Activities Committee, right after the assassination, invited the leaders of the DRE to come and testify about Oswald. This is in the moment when Congress is launching their own investigations. The Dallas police have their own investigations. This is why this is why Johnson's creating the Warren Commission, right? He wants to head off all of these independent investigations. So, but the House Un-American Activities Committee, they're at least in the first few days after the assassination, they're going forward. And so in their memos, they say, well, we're going to have 3 leaders from the DRE come and talk about Oswald. And then a week later, they say, oh, we can't, they won't be available. They're not in the country. Well, what had happened was Joanides gave them permission to leave the country right after the assassination. So it was like, get these guys out of Washington so that nobody will call them to testify. And in fact, that's what the guys in the DRE told me was Luis Fernandez Roca went to Puerto Rico. Juan Manuel Salvat went to Costa Rica. And, they got out of town so that they couldn't be called, and that it was like they were going to be put up and then they don't. So you guys come to the conclusion that Oswald has been manipulated by somebody.
Yeah.
And that when he says, I'm a patsy, that's what he was.
Yes.
You think that?
Which was very consistent with everything he said before his death. I mean, you've got him in jail telling his brother, they don't have a case, telling his wife, let's worry about shoes for the baby. He's not that concerned. And I would say, David, because they didn't show him the rifle, they're not showing him the evidence. I'm not sure that he had a clue as to how badly set up he had been right up to that Sunday morning. David, what's your.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, he definitely was a patsy. He had no idea. Um, Again, we went into a little bit about how he's getting out of the country via the Redbird Airport, via that small rented plane that with
Yeah.
Wayne
So
January was actually
why don't you
reported.
just
Yeah.
tell people a little bit about that? I wanted to get to what you guys call the Redbird lead. So give us the general context of this story. Redbird is an airfield in Dallas. How is it connected to the events of November 22nd, do you think?
Well, it's connected in a couple different ways, and that's why it gets pretty complex because Redbird is a location, and Ray January owns an air company there. Basically, he leases aircraft. He's got a hangar. He leases aircraft for different purposes, but he also works on reselling aircraft. And in another paper called the Redbird Leads, we detail the fact that during the year 1963, he has been working on selling a series of aircraft to the CIA. And particularly by the fall, he is selling aircraft to the CIA to be used most likely in this new program that is coming underway called AmWorld. And it's much too deep to explain here as to why this conspiracy actually may be embedded within AmWorld. But the point being is that on the week of the assassination, he is handing off one of these aircraft, and two people come in, an American and a Cuban. The American is a CIA officer, and due to David's research, we're pretty sure we know what CIA officer, in fact, what his role was in AmWorld, and the fact that he was doing procurement, and a Cuban who's a pilot and a mechanic, and he's going to essentially receive the aircraft. Like, okay, I'm taking the handoff. It's what you said it was going to be. Um, During their conversation early in the week, Ray January and the Cuban get pretty close, and January says something about the president coming to, Dallas, and what do you guys think about him? And the Cuban basically says, we hate him. He betrayed us at the Bay of Pigs, and they're going to kill him. Okay. Uh, January kind of backs off from that, doesn't really pursue it. It's just talk. Um, so that happens early in the week, Monday, Tuesday in the week. And he kind of sets it aside until obviously the afternoon of the assassination. But later in that week, Wednesday or Thursday, these two young people show up at the airport in an old car. They get out, they leave a person in the car, kind of watching what they're doing. Uh, January can see him. He doesn't talk to him. It's kind of curious. And they approach January about renting an aircraft, well, leasing an aircraft with him flying because they want to take a trip, a long trip, kind of implying it's a honeymoon or whatever. And they want to fly to the Yucatan. So they get into all these questions about what kind of plane do you have that has that kind of range, fuel tanks. And January is going, they don't have enough money to rent this airplane. They're in an old car. And I think they're going to hijack this sucker to Cuba.
Yeah.
We don't know what made him think specifically that, but okay. Later, after the assassination, he starts thinking about this. He doesn't even want to talk about the CIA part of that and the Cuban part of that, but it's like, if I saw Lee Harvey Oswald and he feels the guy in the car is Lee Harvey Oswald, I should tell somebody. So he goes to the FBI and recounts this story to the FBI. And the only questions the FBI ask him are have you ever been in the Carousel Club? Do you know Jack Ruby? Are you, socially acquainted with Jack Ruby? And at that point in time, January is clearly, they don't want to hear what I have to say. I should probably shut up and not, no, I didn't, never, whatever. But that sets the stage for what we really think was the manipulation of Oswald by showing Oswald that indeed these people, and we get pretty specific about who would have been in Dallas and who these Two people could have been by tracking the DRE in Dallas. And basically, we think that is the agenda, the part of agenda that was used to manipulate Oswald and, focus his mind on getting out of Dallas, put him in a place where they could control his movements, that sort of thing. So that's kind of, David, what have I missed about the Redbird story?
No, other than Wayne January when he was working with the Cuban, who we believe is Villafana, Manuel Villafana. He was a CIA asset, ran Commandos Mambises for David Morales, and you get to see the same names over and over again here. And we the colonel was a good friend of David Morales. The Air Force colonel was Manny Chavez, who was close friends with Jake Easterling, all these guys. He was a pilot, for the C-47s. He flew those. So he came to check it out. He said, we need it done by Friday. We got to get it out by noon Friday. So the C-47 is got to be ready. So January and this Cuban, Villafana, they worked, nights, and they worked all Thursday night trying to get it in shape and put the seats back in so it could be used for transport. And that was it. After they were done, Wayne January said, I never saw the colonel, the American colonel come back, or, the Cuban again after, 12 o'clock. Then later on, he said, this is probably how they got some of the shooters, this is what he's thinking. The shooters out of Dallas. We know the plane went to Houston. After Houston, we don't know where it went. So
he said he really wished he'd seen if anybody else got on that airplane.
Yeah.
But the idea is that that's what Oswald thought he was doing that day, was going to be getting on a plane and getting out of there.
Meeting his contact at the Texas Theater, which is why he was moving from seat to seat.
Right.
There's supposed to be some recognition signal, whether it's a torn dollar bill, like they would use it for AmWorld. Who knows,
And he had talked. I guess one of the surprising things is back in New Orleans, he had talked with Marina about, he was committed to going to Cuba. They were trying to get her and the kids back to Russia, and had been trying to get her back to Russia since January. But he was going to Cuba. He even talked to her, I may have to hijack an airplane. And would you help? And Marina tells him, you're an idiot. No, I won't help. But, if you can get there, send for me, I might come. But it's not, it was a point in time where hijacking aircraft to Cuba was kind of a thing. And it had been in the press, and it was a way to get a reputation inside Cuba as being a real supporter of the revolution. And again, just my personal observation is Oswald wanted to go to Cuba, but unlike Russia, where he ended up in a factory doing sheet metal work, he did not want to end up in a sugarcane field. He wanted to enter Cuba as a figure worthy of, the revolution's attention.
Right. Somebody asks in the chat, something that's often said in the JFK literature, there's all these sightings of, Oswald, the second Oswald, here and there around Dallas. And I always thought, well, maybe that's just people who mistakenly said they saw Oswald and they didn't, they made a mistake. It wasn't necessarily a sign of foul play. What do you make sense of those stories and that theme in the JFK literature of sightings of other Oswalds?
Well, one thing we do know is that Oswald was looking for jobs, not just at the Texas School Book Depository. He had looked at jobs for other places on his own with the employment agency. We know he even interviewed for a job out by the airport after he was working at the School Book Depository. So the thought that other people might have seen him, I think I looked into the FBI interviews with these people that saw him and identified him as Oswald, especially up and down Main Street, which is kind of interesting, And he was looking for photographic jobs, and the FBI went to a great deal of trouble to convince people that they should take those reports back, because we don't want to expand the picture of what Oswald's doing. But yeah, I think some of those reports are real, that he was looking for other jobs in downtown Dallas and elsewhere. The only one that I'm totally puzzled about, and I can't get it off my mind, is the report of his driving the car and at the car business there in downtown Dallas. And the reason I can't get it out of my mind is, to some extent, it's just like Lee Harvey Oswald to go in and shop. He's getting his driver's license. He's learned how to drive. He can drive. He's just hasn't tested yet. We know all of that through Ruth Payne. So he knows how to drive, and he just decides he's going to go shop for a car. And there's even a report of him talking about car insurance, getting car insurance, but getting the car and getting out and driving and making all of these like just obnoxious statements about I'm getting money, I'm going to Russia, was that an impersonator? The thing is, if it's impersonator, it almost fits Oswald. And everybody will remember it. It's kind of like New Orleans. Is there anybody that won't remember Oswald in New Orleans? No. Okay, you're going to remember this. David, what do you think? That's just, I'm tempted.
Yeah, that's about it. What was the other big one at the shooting range? What supposedly Oswald shooting at the young kid's target, he was there with somebody else. Was that part of the frame?
Could be. I won't. Yeah, you're right. I don't discount that any of that was part of the frame. I wouldn't discount. I don't think there's any way we could know, but I don't think it was. I would be more willing to consider it as probably part of all those incidents, including the shooting range, as part of the setup. Although, quite frankly, our position in the book is, if you can plant a rifle that is traceable to Oswald in schoolbook depository, it doesn't matter. And it's always kind of bugged me. That's like, well, what if Oswald got sick that day? Well, I guarantee you, if Oswald was sick at home with the flu and his rifle was picked up at the site of the shooting, Oswald may not be the shooter, but he is in a conspiracy, and the conspiracy is going to point towards Cuba. You got that rifle, and you can plant it, you're done. He's in.
So actually, I asked this question before. Like, nobody knows how the rifle got to Dallas from New Orleans. There isn't, and Ruth Payne says, no, it was not in the car. Maureen Oswald said, no, it was not in the car. When they unloaded the car, there was no rifle there. And Oswald supposedly was on a bus, right? So there is no way you could actually put that rifle in Oswald's hands,
We don't know that Oswald didn't give the rifle to Bringier along with his Marine book. We don't know what it's an open question. But
or it was in the car with Leopoldo and Angelo when they drove to Sylvia Odio's. It was in the back,
We do know that he was interested in buying a rifle in New Orleans. So had he given his away? Had he what? I don't know.
Right. Just a comment from the chat from Mark. By the way, Larry, before we conclude, I wanted to compliment you on Somebody Would Have Talked. More than any other recent book, it helped shape my own understanding and organize my thoughts on what happened and why. Fantastic book. Thank you. So
that was the starter set. If it's kind of the starter set, and everything afterwards. I mean, if anything, David took those names I put into Someone Would Have Talked and connected them to like other people that now we know who they were and who they were associated with. And, it was kind of like the seed for all of this.
Yeah. A couple other points to get to that are common features. We had Christopher Tidmore on the podcast a couple of months ago, a New Orleans journalist who kind of gave the background of Oswald's family and the local elites, and kind of very interesting kind of cultural and political history of New Orleans. Oswald's connections to organized crime through his uncle, Dutz Moret, is that a factor in the assassination story? How did you think about
We
that?
did look at that because we've got a pretty good idea of what happened when Oswald went to New Orleans. Okay, who he did reach out to his family. He reached out to his aunt, not his uncle. You know, she was reached out to his aunt. He even took the trouble to meet up with a couple of his extended family, even visited a family cemetery. So we know that Oswald did have a connection, and he stayed with his aunt for a period of time. Basically, his aunt said, you know, I've got room for you. I don't have room for your wife and a baby. Sorry. But until he could actually find a job. But there's no sign that he ever, you know, worked for his uncle. I know people talked about, well, okay, he had, you know, he's connected because he was a runner for his uncle. There really is no, he did have courier jobs in New Orleans when he was growing up, but they were for businesses, actually, export businesses. There's just no sign of that. Plus, there's nothing in Oswald's character that really shows him, you know, he would have been disparaging towards criminal connections. That just was not, that wasn't Oswald. So the thought that somebody could, I read a lot lately that different scenarios where he was hired as the shooter or hired as a gunman or hired for this and that. I don't think those people don't hire Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald is not for sale. Like I said, Lee Harvey Oswald is an idealist and he's an asshole, but I don't see him for sale.
A question from Annie. Please repeat what you said about why he went to the theater. I think that's a good question because it's worth breaking it down. So how would you answer Annie's question? Why did Oswald go to the Texas theater, you know, an hour or two after the assassination?
It was a good place. I mean, it's a public place, but it's an inside place to make a contact. If you look at a lot of the protocols that are used in this, if he's going to leave work and make a contact with somebody that he's already knows and who's promised, they've rented the airplane, right? He did not rent the airplane. He wasn't involved in talking to January. So he's got to interface with somebody that can take him to the airport, and they're going to get on the plane and fly out, and they're going to hijack the plane. Okay. Bring your pistol, Lee. You need your pistol, right? Okay. Maybe, but the bottom line is he's meeting people that he knows who have rented the airplane. So is he going to meet them out on the street? Is he going to jump into a car outside the whatever? Now he's supposed to go to the school book depository, locate them in a dark theater. And as David mentioned earlier, he has reported like moving to different places and sitting down by different people. Like, are you the one? Or, you know, oh, wait a minute, who is this? And that's why he's at the theater. It's a low profile place. Now, if he did run in without buying, the problem is that we can't judge his behavior in the theater by, you know, what his mission was, because things have changed so radically for him that afternoon. But one thing that makes this kind of contact very interesting are the reports of other people taken out of the theater that never enter into, you know, any questioning. But more importantly, the police did make a list, and yet obviously they interviewed and took down names of everybody that was in the theater. We don't have that list. It disappeared, which I find very suspicious. So that's just another indicator to us that Oswald was there to make a contact, and those names needed not to be investigated. Who knows what names would, you know, did the police ask for ID? Did they, whatever? But to answer your question, he was there to make a contact with the people who had rented the airplane so that they could take him to that aircraft for that flight. I don't think he would have ever made it to the airport, but he did.
Right.
Why was he so desperate to get to Cuba? Were there some push factors there?
Okay, the answer to that is he wasn't desperate in the sense that he had to go now. He was desperate. If you look at his writing and you look at his remarks, he wanted to go see Cuba for himself. He was always, he questioned everything. And my negative remarks are more about him. I come out of the 60s. A lot of us wanted to see things for ourselves. Don't take anybody's word about it. Oswald was, I don't take anybody's word about anything. I need to see it. I went to Russia. I saw it. It wasn't what I hoped for. I don't know if I'm ever going to find out. He said that to DeMorenshield. Jeff mentioned he had a dialogue with DeMorenshield, and DeMorenshield said, "You realize, Lee, you're an idealist. You may never find what you're looking for." And reported that Oswald said, "Yeah, I understand that, but I've got to go see for myself." He wanted to see. He thought by that time, with what he was reading, and if you read the magazines he was reading, it was all good about Cuba. Cuba had gotten it right. They were taking care of the poor. They had shattered the class structure. Racism, blacks were in the Castro administration. Cuba was doing it right. And he wanted to go see it, and he wanted to go be part of it. And as David said, he had kind of had that in mind all the way back to when he was in the Marine Corps. But a broader answer to your question, he had been back in the U.S. for a year, okay? He had tried to get jobs. He had tried to fit in. He got one job, a photography job, and he liked that. He really, from then on, when he got back to Dallas after Mexico City, he almost got another photography job, except when they did a back check and called the former employer said he was okay, except now and then he spoke Russian at work, and it made the other people nervous, and he didn't get the job. He was not getting any jobs. He was stuck in a manual labor. The employment agencies were telling him that. And he had no references. What's he going to put down as a reference? My reference is the Marine Corps? Well, that doesn't work well. And actually, he did that when he got the school book depository job. He was down to the point of using fake references, fake names. He actually used Heidel as a reference in one job application. So he's at the point by the summer of 1963 where it's not working out back in the U.S. He's focused on Cuba, obsessed on Cuba, and he wants to get there. Even if Marina and the kids go back to Russia, my goal is Cuba. And so I wouldn't call it, he's not under pressure per se, except it's internal pressure. It's himself and his agenda is his pressure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
A question from Jim. Are you saying Oswald had no CIA asset informant affiliations? How would you
he was, yeah, David can join me in on this too. We don't think that he wittingly was serving as a CIA asset in terms of taking missions. Okay, no, nobody is signing him tasks and he's going off and doing them. We think that the CIA was indeed using Oswald and was preparing to use Oswald even more. We think the CIA, in the book, we outlined 2 operations where we think the CIA had an interest in him, and actually was enough so that they were compartmentalizing information inside the CIA. CIA counterintelligence, CIA SIG, Angleton, had a use for Oswald. Oswald doesn't have to know about this. He's just used. SAS, Special Affairs Staff, the New Cuba Project, has a mission for Oswald, but it's not Oswald's mission. It's how they're going to use Oswald and how they're going to manipulate them. And that's why Jeff hasn't gotten it to it. That's one of the reasons that Mexico City is so screwed up, is because SAS is compartmentalizing its information. CISIG is compartmentalizing its information, and everybody is lying to everybody else about knowing anything about Oswald. When Mexico City says, "What's going on with this guy? He's here," and they're told, "Well, the last our records show is, he might come back from Russia." Oh, come on now. No, that better than that. We just talked about Emilio and his brother in New Orleans. You think SAS does not know, and Joanides don't know about? So the more concrete answer to your question is, was Oswald entangled with the CIA? Absolutely. Did the CIA have plans and a use for Oswald? Absolutely. But they were using what he was doing on his own, which is for deniable operations, always the best way to run your game, because you create this distance. If they're doing something you want to make use of, you just let them do it. So you have established deniability, and that's the way it worked. Your assets, spy. We use the word spy for a lot of things that was never. No, that this is so. Oswald was not. Our view is he was not a witting, voluntary CIA asset.
See, one of the things, possible asset too was Sylvia Odio's uncle, Augustine Guitart, was at Oswald's court appearance.
Right.
And he was also a CIA asset. He actually has a 201 file. He was being used as a cutout to recruit his uncle to, defect. So he was very well known. It's Jeff, you know his case officer pretty well there, Carl Trenton. And Trenton was in New Orleans working out of the domestic contact office. So he knew Bringier, this Trenton for the SAS, Larry was mentioned. They knew exactly who Oswald was, and this is how Oswald, these guys got the address in Sylvia Odio's house was from the uncle. The uncle was close friends with Frank Barthez. He was the assistant delegate to the CRC. Barthez was the delegate to the CRC. These guys would all meet at Bartez's house. Carlos Bringier, Ernesto Rodriguez, Barthez, Guitart, Carlos Quiroga, who went to visit Oswald. They all knew who he was. Everybody says it was Bringier that sent Quiroga to Oswald's house. These guys all knew. They would meet in Bartez's house.
And in fact, after the assassination, Bringier tells the New York Times about Quiroga's visit to go see Oswald. He says, "We sent one of our intelligence agents." Yeah. He doesn't mention Quiroga by name, but he says, "We sent one of our intelligence agents." So they're already 3 months before the assassination, they're doing spy versus spy with Oswald. Yeah. And I'll say one more thing about Carl Trenton. So I found him, and he was living in Pennsylvania. I went up to see him. He was a very nice man. And he said, "Yeah, I knew about Oswald." He said, "I got a call from a friend in the FBI after he was arrested. And he asked me, this guy Oswald, is he one of your guys? Like, is he a CIA guy?" So first of all, that's what somebody in the FBI thought at the moment, was that guy's acting like a CIA guy. And Trenton told me, no, we would never touch that guy with a 10-foot pole. But that wasn't true. Angleton had been paying attention to him for 4 years. So it wasn't like, oh no, that guy's of no interest. The top people in the CIA were paying close attention to him. And Trenton basically confirmed that to me, that this is, before the assassination, they were talking about Oswald.
And I think, Jeff, you'll probably remember the name. I keep forgetting it. I think the right term, not asset, not whatever, is useful idiot. The fellow that told his daughter, it's sort of like, yeah, he was just a useful idiot. That doesn't mean Oswald's stupid. That means whatever, he's totally unwitting about what's going on around him from their perspective. Who was that? Do you or David remember that?
Yeah, that was Susan Kent, the daughter of Bill Kent, told me she would bug her father. "Oh, you knew all about, you were in Miami, you were in New Orleans, tell me about JFK." And she said he would never talk to me, never talk to me, never talk to me. She would bug him and bug him and bug him. And she finally said, "Who was Oswald?" And he said, he was a useful idiot. And when she said, who was behind the assassination, he said, "You don't want to know." So that was all, all that Bill Kent, who was also a JM Wave officer, would say to his daughter about what he knew of these events. A couple of people have asked, and it would be incomplete not to ask you, the murder of Officer Tippit, is Oswald involved in that? How do you view that piece of the JFK story?
I wish I knew. I will refer to Tipping Point, which is the book that deals more specifically with that sort of thing. I see two scenarios. first of all, and I don't know which way it falls. I could see it either way. I haven't resolved it in my own mind. David can weigh in, but by that time, what I do see is Tippett's behavior in itself is anomalous. Something was going on with Tippett. I think something was going on in regard to the conspiracy and Oswald. Has nothing to do, again, Oswald's unwitting, but there's some factor in this where he was to pick him up and take him into custody. I mean, if you don't want it to meet him, the Texas School Book Depository, and take him out and shoot him on the sidewalk out front. So what's better way? A policeman intercepts him. You know, the whole thing of Tippett watching the vehicles coming across the bridge is very suggestive. And I go through all of this in that, but I think Tippett there's something wrong with Tippett. So if he did attempt to confront and pick up Oswald, and that wasn't part of Oswald's plan, the way it was supposed to work, might Oswald have shot Tippett? I think it's a possibility. Or David, why don't you weigh in? I just got myself in enough trouble.
No, I mean, that confuses me. I've read a lot about the Tippett thing, and I still can't resolve it in my head either. I suspect there was other people involved that shot Tippett based upon some of the descriptions. The guy running away, curly hair, different, and stuff. But that's a tough one.
Yeah. Let's just see if there's any other. Other questions. Oswald in custody. The Raleigh call, the phone call he makes late at night. What do you make of that story? So just for people who don't know, Oswald makes a phone call while in custody, or asked to make a phone call to North Carolina, gives a number in North Carolina. And what was going on there, do you think?
I was very much interested in that call years and years ago, but at this point in time, so many people have done deep research on the telephone operators and that piece of paper and who handed it to who. Was that really Oswald's call? It doesn't make any sense to me. Oswald, quite frankly, it doesn't dovetail with the other stuff that Oswald was not doing. Oswald, he called Ruth Payne and he said, I might need a lawyer, or the ACLU approaches him and he doesn't really take advantage of them. He's not making a concerted effort like he's concerned that he needs, help immediately. He's just not doing that. So to pass up on all of those opportunities and to make a call to Nag's Head, there are just too many holes in it for me. I at this point in time, I've pretty much dropped that. Some people have done some really good work on it since I first looked at it, and so I'm pretty skeptical that was really Oswald calling. That was Oswald's call to that number, including the guy himself and the guy's wife, and the guy's wife saying, no, it wasn't. He called Dallas because he was drunk, and he called Dallas and said he wanted to talk to Oswald. I don't know. Anyway, that's how the number got written down. Like, have Oswald call me back at this number. David.
Okay, so you don't necessarily attach importance to that call.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
I did at one time.
Well, live and learn, right? Let's see if
Bob clearly has something he wants to say. I can see that.
Okay. Yeah, you don't have to ask your question in the chat. You can just raise your hand or speak up.
Jeff, I have a question.
Sure.
Bob Serkin. Larry, we all know that Anglican and McCone lied before the Warren Commission about their interest in Oswald. They said, Anglican said, I believe, Jeff, you can correct me, that they had no interest in Oswald, yet they were surveilling him in Russia in his early days. They were opening his mail, reading his mail. So what do you think? Was Anglican trying more to protect the agency or Oswald?
I think Bill Simpich has done some really good work on this, and I tend to follow his line of thinking that, especially when we keep in mind that as far as the paperwork trail, they didn't CI/SIG, nobody opened the 201 file for the better part of a year. Okay. And then it gets opened within CI/SIG, not Soviet division, which is where you would expect it to go. And Jeff may correct me on this, but I still think that Malcolm Blunt and Bill, and in tracing all of this, the information that should be going to the Soviet division wasn't. It was staying within CI/SIG. The State Department was copying the CIA and copying the FBI. Most of the information inside Russia was coming from state, okay. But I think Angleton decided to use Oswald as, basically as one of his spy games. Like, who knows something about Oswald that they shouldn't? So where is my leak? That's just kind of classic Angleton. And I think Angleton continued doing that. I think this was, if we had the full trail, it would be, how can James Angleton use information about Lee Harvey Oswald to find out where is it that it shouldn't be, which is kind of fascinating in that SAS was not playing that game. It's like SAS knows things that they're not providing to anybody else. Well, I love this when divisions work against each other. So I think Angleton certainly lied. I mean, basically every CI officer attached to this lied. Shackley lied. They did investigate after the assassination. We now know that, but he'd lied under oath. They all lied about what they knew about. So, but that would be my cut on Angleton. Yeah, he does have a game in play with information about Oswald.
For sure. Yeah.
So,
thank you.
Well, we've been talking for an hour and a half, and thank you, Larry and David. Fascinating discussion. I recommend the book to everybody. I learned a lot from it, and I think you can tell from this conversation, it is a very fresh look at Oswald, and I think anybody who reads this would enjoy the book. So, if we have any more questions, we'll give a last chance. Anybody want to ask a question? Otherwise, we will wrap it up for the evening.
Two hands up. Two hands up, Jeff.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. First of all, thank you very much for this. It qualifies as actually an original work within the universe of JFK assassination literature, which is, after all this time, is quite an achievement. So thank you very much. But I just had a very quick question. So in the book, you talk about how Oswald, and this is the chapter right before he goes to the United States, and you say that he acquired authorization to travel directly to the United States. And then at the end of that chapter, which is chapter 5, you say that he eventually signed a promissory note, and in June he and his family boarded ship for the United States. And then it goes in chapter 6, he's already in the US. Now, this may be a small thing and you would know much more about it than I would, but there's been some chatter over the years about whether the 36 hours that he spent in the Netherlands before he boarded the boat, whether he might have somehow been debriefed there by the CIA, and whether, there was some kind of safe house there. I'm not sure Marina could account for his movements there in Rotterdam or wherever. What do you think about that? I mean, I'm sure that you thought about it in the interests of being concise and brevity and all that. You had to move on, but I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all about that. My guess, though, is that I do think that somewhere on his way back, and probably not in Moscow, right? Because you're not going to let Lee Harvey go into the embassy in Moscow, which is bugged, right? And have your State Department or CIA, liaison officer start asking him questions and hear what he says. That's not going to happen, okay? So you got to do it somewhere else. That would be a fine place to do it. In New York City, where he's overnight, and we're not totally sure who he talked with, but that happened somewhere. So, Chad, I'm in my mind, I'm convinced that he had made something of a deal, or he wouldn't have written that on his way back on the boat. So since he wrote that on his way back on the boat, I have tended to think it wasn't in New York. I've tended to think it was somewhere in between, and that makes a lot of sense to me. But it also makes a lot of sense to me that Oswald at that point in time, quite frankly, was doing a deal with the State Department. You know, he was going further than he would have wanted to. You know, he was making concessions. Like Oswald never really wanted to make concessions to anybody, but he was. So yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I just can't prove it, but it makes perfect sense.
Okay, thanks.
Tim Harmon.
Larry, that's a great book, and it really seems to fit hand in glove with the kind of things that we've been talking about around Jeff's research and studying the CIA files this year and all that. It really fits. One thing I can't make sense of, though, is he apparently was beginning to be set up, if this theory or this way of thinking holds, before he started working at the book depository. So was that just some lucky accident that he ended up there?
That's a great question. I'm surprised. Well, first of all, I need to do two things. We would not have been able to write the book, Tipping Point, without Jeff. We would not have been able to write the third part of this book without Jeff and his research on the DRE in Miami. So that really needs to be acknowledged. And we didn't put that in the book because we wanted to make sure he'd invite us to the show. No, just kidding. Okay. But on your question, that's probably the biggest pushback, because everybody wants to have him, the school book depository job, as part of the plot. Okay. It's just so intuitive and so natural. But the counter I give to that is he is visiting weekly his wife, who lived next door from somebody who works at the school book depository, and they're talking to their neighbors. We know they talk. And the thought that he would get a lead to a job in the school book depository when it has no job and is constantly looking for jobs doesn't really surprise me that much. But here's what I see, and that's the reason I made the remark earlier. I'm the bad guy. It does not matter where he is working if I want to have him in the conspiracy. Basically, two things are known about Dallas weeks in advance. If you look at, and Jack Ruby would have known this, Jack Ruby is an important part of the equation. Any motorcade in Dallas that's a political motorcade in Dallas is going to come down Main Street, and it's going through Dealey Plaza. I don't have to know any more. I know that's going to happen. That's going to be part of the equation. The Oswald on Main Street, that job interviews that the FBI checked out, maybe it was Oswald, maybe it was an impersonator. But there was actually a history that put, even before he did this before he got the school book depository job. There are I saw Oswald applying for a job here, up and down Main Street and on Houston, no less. Okay. And then he shows up employed in the Texas School Book Depository. So I don't feel compelled to say that the School Book Depository was mandatory. I think Oswald was mandatory. That rifle was mandatory. Having something to use to frame him is mandatory. I know people won't like it, but I see it as it's bad luck on Oswald's part. And the other thing that persuades me of that is we know that he actually continued to look for other jobs. He had gotten tired of the school book depository, and he was looking elsewhere. He just had not gotten another job. And I think if he was knowledgeable and part of it and then there because he was supposed to be there, why would he have been looking for other jobs? So I do view it as circumstance, an unlucky circumstance, but I'm not sure it would have saved his life anyway.
Right.
I got one thing to say. This book would not exist if it wasn't for Rex Bradford, too. I mean, Rex,
yes.
Tremendous editor. He held our noses to the keyboards for the longest time and just kept, wouldn't exist without Rex. Tremendous.
Right. And also,
I can't say that because of the trauma. I'm sure in a year or so
he hasn't recovered yet. Rex has not recovered.
Rex is the, if you ever think of writing a book, Rex is the best and worst possible editor. A, he is an absolute fanatic for grammar, punctuation, and anything format and layout that anybody would do. And B, he knows this subject way too well. I mean, I've written 14 books, and other editors do not go, Larry, you really didn't touch on this, and you really should. Okay, Rex.
Mexico City, Larry. Mexico City.
Mexico City. I really tried like heck to avoid Mexico City, but he would not let go.
No.
Can I jump in with one quick question? And it's been a great evening.
Sure.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for the book. I'm looking forward to reading it. I just want to ask about Antonio Veciana, who claimed to have seen Oswald in the presence of Maurice Bishop or David Atlee Phillips. And I don't know how they cannot be connected or how he could not be an asset or working with the agency, given his claims. And he seems very credible.
Okay, John Newman promised me that when he destroyed Viciana's testimony about from inside Cuba, that he would go on and deal with Veciana after Cuba. And he has yet to do that. So, like, oh, no, just kidding. But he did. Anyway, I certainly see there are two things going on here. There's Veciana in Cuba. And I think pretty much everything Veciana wrote in his book about Cuba has been deconstructed by Newman. I think he did a good job of that. However, and someone would have talked, I laid out the things that would support that Phillips did know Viciana and the organization that Viciana was working for. That's not Viciana as an asset. That's just Phillips working with a group that was out to assassinate Castro inside Cuba, which Viciana's group most definitely was. Now we got Viciana back in the United States. Is Viciana a CIA asset? I don't think so. Is he a Phillips asset? That's another story entirely, because Phillips ran his own game. Phillips had his own media assets outside the CIA. Phillips, when he got to be station chief and direct what, in South America, he ran his own games. Yeah. I've yet to see how Viciana got to, when he was restricted to travel inside Miami, shows up in Chile with Phillips is there running this operation against their president. Asked how did Viciana get there? There are a lot of unanswered questions about Viciana. The other thing that really galls me is Viciana talked about, not about, yeah, he did about Dallas, okay, but he talked about one of the meetings that he had with Phillips, where Phillips was out of the room for a little bit in the restroom or whatever, and he looked in his briefcase. This would be classic Phillips, whose tradecraft was just as bad as Howard Hunt's. And he saw a memo about a new operation in there. He didn't have a chance to read it all, but it was signed H. We know Henry Heckscher at that point in time was working with David Phillips, and they were both assigned to AmWorld. And Heckscher did frequently just put H on his documents. So, long-winded answer to your question. I'm sorry, that's the only kind of, I do not totally reject Viciana having private contact with David Phillips inside the United States, and Phillips thinking about some role for him, even outside the CIA. I don't trust Phillips for an instant. Phillips ran his own games.
But my question, Larry, was that Viciana claimed that he saw, when he was meeting Phillips, Lee Harvey Oswald. That's my question. I
don't trust that. I don't trust that. That's why I'm mixed on Viciana. I think he may have had some contact with Phillips, but I see no reason why. If you go back what we've said about Oswald himself, not an operational asset, he's being manipulated. I don't see a personal meeting between David Phillips and Lee Harvey Oswald that Viciana witnesses in Dallas that makes sense to me. David, you want so no, not to me, maybe to David. All over to him.
No, Viciana was a CIA asset up until September of 1962. After that, he actually started working for ACIS, the Army Intelligence. There's a huge documentary load on what Vesiano was doing, how he was working with the SNFE, Eli Manoya Guterres. They went all the way until like March of 63. Vesiano's trying to get a boat back, from the Army Intelligence. I don't see any contact Vesiano had with the CIA after 62. In 62, when he was in Cuba, he was working he had a couple CIA paramilitary guys that were running him. One of them was Cal Hicks. The other guy was Jim Pekich. Calvin Hicks, continued to be his case officer up until September of 62. And Hicks ended up working for SAS and JM Wave, paramilitary guys. Where I think Vesiano got the name Bishop is when Hicks, Pekich, and who was using the name Jim Bowden at the time, met this guy called Bishop. And they had Vesiano was there. This is part of the old assassination when they were trying to assassinate Castro back in Havana in 61. I think Bishop was using the name Harold Bishop. Bill Simpich has done quite a bit of work on this, who Harold Bishop might be. So if you look at some of the early things that Vesiano was saying, he didn't know Bishop's first name. We were looking at, was it Jim Bishop? Was this? Then he ended up coming with Morris, then became Maurice Bishop. So that's some of the early history of what Vesiano was doing with Bishop. I mean, I have my own suspicions who Bishop is, but it's different.
But I would expand on one reason why I'm so skeptical of Vesiano and Phillips, except on certain very specific points, is that I remember at a Dallas conference where Gaten Fonzie's wife showed up. Vesiano had just written his book, and he was just launching his book that had all this additional information in it. I mean, Vesiano never talked to Fonzie about Oswald and Bishop or Oswald and Phil. This is a brand new story that comes out in his book. And suddenly his book is coming out, and he writes Gaten's wife saying, oh yeah, I did know Phillips, and she brings this letter, okay, to the conference. And I'm reading this and I'm going, oh, good heavens, now this is absolute proof. Well, now my estimate is this new book where he becomes some kind of a super spy inside Cuba and heavy training and all this other stuff, plus this story was made up for that book, which includes the story you just mentioned, Tim, about Oswald. I think he added that as a sweetener. I mistrust that a great deal, although I don't mistrust that Phillips may have had some contact with him.
Could I ask a question? I'm sorry. I just wonder, I'm convinced from all your writings and others that Harvey Oswald was not the assassin. I know that. But who was? Who did pull the trigger? Can you tell me that?
The names that we would put forth, the names that David would put forth, just in case anybody's listening and taking down who to visit. Sorry, David. We put that at a book called Tipping Point, okay? And we spelled out the names of the Cuban exiles and the CIA officers, a group, not in, I can't give you a name, that we would continue as potential suspects, person of interest, as far as the attack in Dallas specifically. How that came together, who told what to do what, who was in charge of it. If you want a name, most likely as far as the CIA officer associated with the operation in Dallas, Rip Robertson. David may have another name.
No.
As far as the actual Cuban exiles, a half a dozen guys, all of whom went on to come into AmWorld and were black exfiltrated after the attack in Dallas and never showed up in the U.S. again for years. Kind of like those DRE guys, what would be suspicious? Who left the U.S. after November 22nd and you didn't see again for a year? They're your suspects. but I would tie in, there has to be some field support in Dallas. And that's where John Roselli, connection to William Harvey, connection to Jack Ruby comes in. So there's this assault team, and then there's this support team. And we do give some names for that and go over the scenario for how that happened. But it is speculative, that's as close as we can get, though.
Yeah, if you're going to use somebody, it's going to be people you know very well, people you trust, people you've worked with before. Who'd you work with for the Bay of Pigs? Who'd you train? If Rip Robertson is going to use people, they have to be somebody he trusts and they trust him back, knowing that he has their backs. So that's who you're looking at.
Yeah.
There was one guy with him at the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
We're going to have to wrap it up there. We've been talking for 2 hours. Thank you, guys. This is probably the longest JFK Live we've ever had, clocking in at 2 hours, but well worth the time. Fascinating book. Like I said, everybody, it's mandatory. You have to go buy this book now. And thank you guys for coming on, and we'll see everybody next week.